The Russians, opponents of Putin, prepared their mortars to destroy tanks serving Russia near Baku. These same men walked through the snow carrying their RPGs and rifles searching. The border guards crossed into Putin's territory and fought against his men, until the Federal Security Service Special Forces acted against them, destroying their weapons and warning them never to return. Still, these conflicts between Russians inside Russia and Ukraine were nowhere near ending. Putin's special operation kept Russians free from major problems for a long time. They were able to continue their lives except when they were called up to take part in the conflicts in Ukraine, or when they decided to protest or criticize the armed forces. In these last two cases, they could end up in prison. Things started to change in May 2023 when anti-Putin groups entered heavily armed across the Belgorod border, starting fights against the local forces until they were driven out. Apparently, it was nothing more than a quick incursion that month, something that led to accusations, bluster, and lies. Both sides talked about how many casualties they suffered and how many deaths occurred on the other side. There was a certain amount of exaggeration from both sides about the damage inflicted on the enemy and about what they lost. A basic comment was that there were Russians on both sides. You couldn't really expect anyone to talk seriously about numbers in war, and yes, there were many Russians on both sides. Among the invaders was the Freedom of Russia Legion. The Freedom of Russia Legion made up of 2 battalions. They claimed to be fighting against the corruption of the Russian government and the loss of civil rights in the country. They had no nominal leaders except for a mysterious figure with the codename Caesar, who was once part of the Russian imperial movement, and he left it, saying he no longer agreed with the extremist views. Since before the Donbass War in 2014, when many members of that organization took part in the conflict alongside Putin. Another group that deserved attention was the Russian Volunteer Corps or Russian Volunteer Corps, although the Russian Volunteer Corps did not have a defined ideology. Besides being anti-Putin and having a greater diversity of members, like the Free Cossack Squad, an important point was connected to this. Its leader was Denis Kasputin, a man banned from much of the European Union for a reason. Neo-Nazism. In Germany, he was called one of the most influential neo-Nazi activists in the country. He also led a brand called White Rex with the Black Sun logo, a symbol associated with neo-Nazi groups. These 2 points led to an important question. Both sides have always loved accusing each other of Nazism, with Putin using the banner of denazification for the invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, I will add a specific note in this video to talk about this in the last part. If you like to make excuses for Nazis in Ukraine or Nazis in Russia, I think it's better to watch without making excuses for Nazis. And both sides generalizing entire peoples and armed forces as such is also not fair. Even if the presence of this vile movement, of this criminal ideology, is present where necessary. Since I'm going to talk about troops led by Denis Kasputin, who follows these perverse concepts, not to use harsher words. I've already talked in other videos about the Wagner Group, which is not a Nazi group, but was led by a neo-Nazi, with Nazi tattoos and a code name referencing the favorite composer of that regime. So, skip to the last chapter if you want to see the complex political interaction of these movements in the Ukraine and Russia conflict. The Freedom of Russia Legion actively participated in combat in Ukraine for long periods. While there were no incursions in Belgorod, one of its battalions operated in Donetsk, in villages like Zaitsev, near Bakhmut. Their drone teams were efficient with good equipment and cameras to locate the enemies. Their ability to pass coordinates to the Freedom of Russia Legion mortar groups enabled strikes against Russian artillery. A Vostika self-propelled artillery system was found among the trees and took a shell on its armor. The drones from the Freedom of Russia Legion's 1st Mechanized Battalion also spotted a hidden 152mm howitzer. In the same way, it became yet another easy target for the teams moving through the hot forests of the Ukrainian summer. The movements of the criminal armed forces were continuously and patiently monitored by the men of the Freedom of Russia Legion. The caution allowed them to find some of their bases and ammunition depots. The next shots against these targets were made by highly mobile teams, who had to take risks to find the correct positions before firing and moving out. The destruction of the ammunition depots caused explosions that were seen and heard from far away. Other bases were identified in the village also by the drone teams. The Freedom of Russia Legion artillery moved and began to unleash punishment against the enemies. Not even the T-72 tanks were safe from these strategies. They moved through Zaitsev with their anti-drone cages over the turrets, fearing that kamikaze drones would fall onto their armor or that grenades would be thrown through the open hatches. They returned from their missions and hid among the trees, but the Freedom of Russia Legion had tracked their entire route. The projectiles flew at the stationary T-72s, tearing through the camouflaged metal of 5 of them. These were some examples released by the Freedom of Russia Legion about their actions outside the incursions in Belgorod. In addition, demonstrations of support took place in Moscow and other cities, with the blue and white flag colors representing the group being displayed. In some ways, these were small movements, but they gained some courage in the face of Putin's tough policy against political opponents. Of course, none of them really posed a serious threat to the Kremlin's power. June 1st, 2023 began with Russian TOS-1S firing at Freedom of Russia Legion forces, their allies, who had launched a new incursion toward the Shebekinsk district. Soon after, images appeared of Ukrainian shelling on the roads in that direction, with the Russians claiming that 2 women had been killed. Shebekinsk began to burn. The Russians accused the Ukrainians of attacking civilian targets. An evacuation was initiated, fearing an escalation of the conflict. Freedom of Russia Legion drones began to show the dense clouds of smoke from bombed regions, bringing the war to yet another part of Russian territory and putting civilians under the terror of bombers. On June 4th, the incursion forces, already finished, began to move through the bombed region, circling around the village of Novaya Tavuzanka within the Shebekinsk district. The mortar teams, under the watchful eyes of their comrades, advanced into the territory and fired at targets indicated by the drones. Then they moved quickly among the trees to avoid Russian artillery. The incursion was now taking place further southeast of Belgorod, where the clouds of smoke were starting to grow thicker, with many civilian structures being affected by the fighting. The citizens of Novaya Tavuzanka filmed from their windows as the raiders used the buildings as cover in the fight against the few Russian armed forces that had arrived at the scene. They moved quickly to avoid artillery fire, knowing well the paths they took to avoid being surrounded and still maintain escape routes. The Freedom of Russia Legion's drones were in the air not just to observe, their grenades were dropped to explode under a Russian BMP-3, putting an end to the troops' transport. When part of the resistance was overcome, the first prisoners were captured. The invading forces marched through the city, still with plans to carry out. The men of the Russian Volunteer Corps even claimed that Novaya Tavuzanka had been abandoned by the Russian army. The tanks of this group entered the village without resistance. During this stage, the tracks moved over the asphalt with the cannons, with no enemies to fight. At that moment, Russian resistance soon began to appear. The fighting became more intense, and the forests around the village, where many troops and mortar teams were hiding, began to be bombarded by the Russians. Reinforcements arrived in the form of Spetsnaz from the Federal Security Service. The troops showed up with the BTR-80 for protection, moving slowly through the village streets to avoid ambushes. The firefights with rifles took place right next to the Russians' homes. RPGs were aimed at the houses, where soldiers and enemies took cover, destroying the buildings. The fighting intensified to a point where the Russians became isolated and were forced to flee. The FLR forces resisted the Federal Security Service's advance, firing from positions where there had always been a strong smell. The balconies of the houses or the walls served as cover. Against the enemy, who advanced with new firepower, the resistance held out as long as it could. The Kremlin soldiers advanced, gaining confidence, but were surprised by the enemy. Colonel Andrei Stasev was mortally wounded in a battle on the streets of Novaya Tobolsk. Russian artillery sought revenge. Their drones found the houses where the FLR and the Russian Volunteer Corps were stationed. The explosion was the first signal for the invaders to return. Afterwards, the drones made sure the tanks were put out of commission. The armored vehicles were found abandoned. The specialists inspected them and then destroyed them. In the middle of the destroyed village, with the marks of battle, the firefighters began to work. The Russian troops kept a vigil to make sure the intruders had really left. The sappers analyzed the main bombing areas to make sure there were no active explosives. It seemed to be over. It just seemed that way, with the Spetsnaz making threats so that none of the invaders would try to cross the border. Once again, while some officials claimed that everything had returned to normal, on the other side, the Russian Volunteer Corps released videos with captured Russians. The violence would still continue within the territory of the Federation. Now, with Chechens carrying their message of revenge, the separate Special Purposes Battalion was made up of Chechens who did not agree with the invasion of Chechnya, and also with the betrayal of Kadyrov's father, which allowed Putin to take over the country for good. In the early 2000s, a group of these men marched through Russian territory in silence, unnoticed by the local forces. No drone detected them. Among the woods, they ended up near a road where a rural truck was passing by transporting Russian military supplies. The rifles and RPGs were loaded and aimed for the ambush. The impact of the rounds completely surprised the driver, who steered the truck to the side of the road. The Chechens came out of the bushes shooting without hesitation to prevent a counterattack. The shooting continued as long as there were signs of movement inside the truck. The soldiers approached with their rifles aimed at a smoking vehicle and confirmed that 2 Russians were dead. The mission of another incursion to test the Russian borders was accomplished. They returned to Ukraine, from where a new invasion would be launched later in December. The last incursion of 2023 took place with boots stepping on the snow and many members of the group wearing white camouflage to blend in with the cold landscape. A little earlier, a reconnaissance tower had been destroyed by a drone as part of the plans to facilitate access to the border. The men moved stealthily through the silent forest, looking for the border guards' footprints. Everything indicated that the enemies had set up base in one of the houses, trying to warm themselves after a patrol in Russia's harsh winter. The Freedom of Russia Legion attackers arrived at the location and carefully took up positions to prepare for the attack. Surprise! The rifles heated up the day with the shots kicking up the snow. The hot barrels were active for many minutes, clearing the way for the men with RPGs. The grenades hit the house, starting a fire that began to consume the place. The rifles kept firing while the men pulled back. The grenade launcher, the GS-17, was the finishing touch, firing so many explosives at the building that it collapsed. The Freedom of Russia Legion men went to check what was left of the base of the Bears loyal to Putin, finding only wreckage. There was a discussion about whether there were actually soldiers there. What was most impressive was that the entry of forces opposing the Kremlin was becoming more and more frequent in Belgorod. The borders seemed practically open. For someone motivated, this kind of activity inspired courage in other people. Like in the case of an FLR supporter who managed to set fire to a fuel tank in Voronezh, far away from where the invasions were happening. Or an attack in Novosibirsk, where a saboteur set fire to an Sukhoi, 24 aircraft that was waiting for repairs and modernization. The sovereign territory of Russia was never threatened by these attacks. The invaders said that wasn't even their intention. However, the name People's Republic of Belgorod mocks the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. It became popular among jokes. It was a sign that there was a way for the saboteurs to gain more confidence. Russia promised that nothing would be that easy. These clashes erupted in their most violent forms. In 2024, Russians, Chechens, Poles, and Belarusians would fight against their compatriots on each side, spilling the blood of brothers to fertilize the land in the most unpleasant way possible. But if humans didn't care about killing each other, the land, fate, or death wouldn't care about receiving their bodies, lives, and souls. The Azov battalion was part of Putin's propaganda for the war in Ukraine. In fact, Azov did have serious problems with Nazism. It's undeniable given so many reports. And the ideology and ultranationalist movements with this ideology did occur in Ukraine. You can't deny the existence of the problem and try to cover it up. And this was so well known and documented that there are full documentaries on YouTube from before the Russian invasion in 2022. I recommend watching all of them to better understand the situation. But there are various reports about movements in Ukraine associated with Nazism, ultranationalism, and the far right. Some of them were indeed used by Kiev as forces in the fight against Russia. Many of these ultranationalist movements often overlap and interact with neo-Nazism in both countries. Far-right vigilantes were willing to use intimidation and even violence to advance their agendas. And often they did so with the tacit approval of law enforcement agencies. The takeover of Crimea by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2014 exposed for the first time the decrepit condition of Ukraine's armed forces. At the time, right-wing militias like Azov and Right Sector stepped into the gap, pushing back Russian-backed separatists while Ukraine's regular military regrouped. What also can't be denied is that these groups accounted for 2% of the votes in 2019. Although it needs to be made clear this is still a problem. But denazification was more of a banner for Russia in the invasion, a fact that could be better applied to an internal struggle of Putin than to something external. Neo-Nazism is a problem in Russia. Putin fought against the ideology in such a political way that it was reminiscent of the actions of other older leaders around the world. He used so-called managed nationalism or controlled nationalism. Movements against Putin and those involved in assassinations were suppressed and revoked. Supremacist groups like Schultz 88 and the Russian Nationalist Battle Organization were arrested and eliminated. Putin
Putin's government revoke these killers and put an end to the organizations.
However, names like Denis Ivanovich Nekrasov, an important member of the Russian imperial movement, continued to hold significance in one of the organizations. As part of Putin's managed nationalism, this group is described as Russian ultranationalist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and a far-right paramilitary organization. It is said that the Russian imperial movement and the government have a relationship like an adversarial symbiosis. It is suggested that as long as there are no terrorist activities within the country, certain entities are allowed to operate freely, provide training to militants, and send troops to foreign conflicts that are in Russia's interest. Western intelligence officials claim that there are beliefs that the movement has connections and collaborates with Russian intelligence. Denis Nekrasov himself fought alongside Russian troops in Donbass in 2014 and later in 2022 died when a mine hit his vehicle in Izium. Also in April of that year, the Russian imperial movement took part in military training for neo-Nazis in Finland, Germany, and even in the United States. This organization operates military camps near St. Petersburg, where neo-Nazis and white supremacists from all over Europe are trained in terrorist activities. Speaking of the United States, contact was made with Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi group classified as a terrorist organization associated with 8 murders and several violent hate crimes in the United States. Still speaking about the Americans, Ricardo Nazaro worked with the FBI and CIA before founding the neo-Nazi group The Base, becoming a wanted man, marrying a Russian woman, and finding refuge in Russia. This acceptance of foreigners with such tendencies was common in Russia as long as it didn't bother Putin. Between 70 and 300 Serbians, most of whom were linked to far-right and ultra-nationalist groups, joined the conflict in Ukraine, on the Russian side starting in 2014. The accusations were widespread in that regard, deep in the forests of Slovakia. Former Russian Spetsnaz commandos are said to have trained young people from a right-wing paramilitary group called Slovak Conscripts, who reportedly even went to fight in Donbass. As for the symbols associated with or co-opted by Nazis and neo-Nazis, they end up being common among armed forces, paramilitary groups, and civilians in both countries. The difference is that when one side uses them, their supporters claim it's a pagan symbol, and when the other side uses them, they claim it's proof of Nazism. Something that happened, for example, in the discussion about the ideology and symbols used by Roman Zorobyov, a senior lieutenant of the so-called pro-Russia paramilitary group Somalia Battalion. One of the founders of Russian neo-paganism, the former dissident Alexei Dobrovolsky, shared the ideas of National Socialism and transferred them to his neo-pagan doctrine. Dobrovolsky stated, "The 8-armed kolovrat, consisting of 2 overlapping swastikas, is considered in Slavic neo-paganism as the ancient Slavic sign of the sun, a symbol of an uncompromising national liberation struggle against Jewish yoke." According to Dobrovolsky, the meaning of the kolovrat completely coincides with the meaning of the Nazi swastika. This symbolism affects the population, even if there is government repression, when movements are considered terrorist if they actively act against the government or cause murders. Between 2000 and 2017 alone, there were 495 incidents of far-right political violence in Russia, causing 459 deaths. This rate is 5 times higher than that of the United States and more than 7 times higher than that of Western Europe during the same period. Data shows that the rates dropped significantly in the second decade, but surprisingly started to rise again. After the war in Ukraine, with ultra-nationalist and racial movements increasing crimes against immigrants and ethnic groups, while the number of victims rose, convictions remained the same. Speaking about Alexei Milchikov reporting in Russia under the total extermination of Ukrainians, it's even repeating very clear information from a man who declared himself a neo-Nazi in an interview. And he clarifies that he is not an imperialist or anything else but a Nazi. And he continued fighting alongside the Russian army for years, even reaffirming that prisoners of war should be executed. But there is an important point. This does not mean that all of Russia is Nazi. You can't generalize an entire people, nor does it mean that Putin is a Nazi. Leaders have flirted with far-right movements without being part of them, using them for their political agendas, as happened in Brazil with Getúlio Vargas. What he does is manage nationalism. That's why it's necessary to be careful when talking about these movements. They mix together, they are used by politicians and in wars. So don't generalize, do your research, observe the elements,